The groan of the wheels was the only thing that had sounded the same for the last 1,000 miles. It was a long, low complaint against the dust, the ruts, and the endless, indifferent sun. When the stagecoach finally lurched to a stop, the silence that followed felt louder than the noise it replaced. Evelyn Grace waited a moment, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that the knuckles were white moons against her skin. She held her breath, a habit she could not seem to break, as if the air itself was a thief waiting to steal what little resolve she had left. The door was pulled open by a lanky boy whose face was a constellation of freckles. He offered a hand, but she ignored it, gathering her skirts and stepping down onto the packed earth of Dry Creek, the hem of her gray traveling dress, already stained with the grime of the journey, immediately collected a fine layer of pale, flour-like dust. She felt the sun on the back of her neck, not as a warmth, but as a weight, a heavy hand pressing her down. It baked the street, bleached the signs on the storefronts, and glared off the dry, cracked faces of the people who had stopped to watch her arrive. Every eye in that town, it seemed, was a pinprick on her skin. Dry Creek was little more than a single, wide street carved from a landscape of brittle hope, a general store, a saloon with swinging doors that seemed to gasp in the heat, a blacksmith's forge sending up a shimmer of angry air, and a handful of other weary-looking buildings stood like tired soldiers against an enemy they could not defeat. The sun was that enemy. It was in the squint of the townsfolk, in the warped wood of the boardwalk, in the very color of the sky, which was not blue but a pale, washed-out sheet of heat. Evelyn felt as though the light itself was a holy instrument, seeking out the stains on her soul and laying them bare for all to see. They stared. Of course they stared. A mail-order bride was a spectacle, a piece of merchandise delivered by coach, a gamble made by a lonely man. But their stares were more than curious. She saw the judgment in the tight-lipped purse of the women's mouths, their eyes flicking from her worn face to her simple luggage, assessing and dismissing her in a single glance. She heard the low murmurs that slithered through the air like sidewinders, words just indistinct enough to be deniable, but sharp enough to wound. "That's her," a woman whispered to another behind a gloved hand. "The one from St. Louis." The other woman's eyes widened with a look that was part pity, part morbid fascination. In the shadows of the saloon's porch, a cluster of men watched with a different kind of interest, a lazy, contemptuous appraisal that made Evelyn's stomach clench. They saw not a woman, but a story, a scandal delivered right to their doorstep, a piece of damaged goods. She stood her ground beside her trunk, a solitary island in a sea of whispers. She had known it would be like this. The letter from the agency had been clear. Mr. Calder Reed was a man of property, a rancher, seeking a wife to make a home. He was, the letter noted, a quiet man. It said nothing of the town he lived near, a place that seemed to have judged and convicted her before she had even taken her first breath of its dusty air. She kept her chin high, a small act of defiance that cost her dearly. Inside, she was a hollow, trembling thing. He was late. The sun crawled higher, pressing down with more force. The stagecoach driver, a man with a tobacco-stained beard, grunted as he heaved her trunk onto the boardwalk. "He'll be along," he said, not unkindly, before climbing back onto his seat and cracking his whip. The coach pulled away, leaving Evelyn truly and utterly alone, the dust of its departure settling upon her like a funeral shroud. Then he came. He did not ride into town with any fanfare. He simply appeared at the end of the street, a tall figure on a dark horse, moving with an unhurried pace that was somehow more intimidating than a gallop. As he drew closer, she saw that Calder Reed was a man carved from the same hard land as the town. He was tall, broader in the shoulder than she had expected, with a face that seemed set in a permanent state of severity. His hat was pulled low, casting his eyes in shadow, but she could feel their intensity. There were lines around his mouth that spoke not of laughter, but of tension, of words held back for years. He pulled his horse to a halt a few feet away from her, the animal stamping impatiently in the dust. He did not dismount immediately. He just sat there, looking down at her. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. He was taking her measure. She knew, and she felt a desperate urge to smooth her dress, to fix her hair, which had come loose from its pins, but she forced her hands to remain still at her sides. Finally, he swung a long leg over his horse and landed on the ground with a soft thud of worn leather boots. He offered no words of welcome, no smile, not even a tip of his hat. He simply walked past her to where a second horse, a tired-looking mare, was tied to the hitching post. He untied the reins and held them out to her. His gaze met hers for the first time, and she saw that his eyes were a pale, distant gray, like a winter sky. They held a pain so old and deep it looked like part of the man himself, as immutable as the color of his eyes. "This one's yours," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough like stones grinding together. It was the first time she had heard it, and it offered no comfort. She took the reins, her fingers brushing his. His hand was calloused and rough, and he pulled it back as if her touch had burned him. He turned without another word, lifted her trunk with an unnerving ease, and tied it securely to the back of his own saddle. He mounted his horse in one fluid motion and waited, his back to her, looking out toward the trail that led away from town, away from everything. Evelyn put a foot in the stirrup and pulled herself onto the mare. The saddle was worn and the leather cracked, but it felt solid beneath her. She arranged her skirts as best she could and urged the horse forward, falling into place a few paces behind his. As they rode out of Dry Creek, she did not look back. She could still feel the eyes of the townsfolk on her, a physical weight that she would carry with her into this new, silent life. The trail to his ranch was a slow, punishing journey. The landscape was a study in desolation. The sun beat down, turning the air into a suffocating blanket, brittle. Yellowed grass crunched under the horse's hooves. The ground was scarred with jagged rock formations that looked like the exposed bones of the earth. Every so often, a gust of wind would rise from nowhere, a hot, angry breath that kicked up clouds of dust that stung her eyes and coated her tongue with grit. It was a land that offered no softness, no forgiveness. The silence between them was as vast and empty as the plains stretching out on either side. It was not a peaceful silence. It was a living thing, thick with unspoken questions and old sorrows. It pressed in on Evelyn until she felt she would scream. She had to break it, had to hear a human voice, even his, "It is a long way from town," she said, her own voice sounding thin and foreign in the immense quiet. He did not turn his head. For a long moment, she thought he would not answer at all. When he finally did, his word was clipped. Yes. She tried again, her heart thumping with a nervous rhythm against her ribs. Do you own many cattle?" Another pause. "Enough." His answers were walls. Each one was a stone placed carefully on top of the last, building a fortress around him that she could not hope to breach. She looked at his back, at the rigid set of his shoulders. She watched his hands on the reins, his knuckles tight, and in the rare moments he turned his head to scan the horizon. She saw the tightness in his jaw, a muscle working silently, relentlessly. This was a man at war with something, and she was an unwelcome witness in his private battlefield. She fell silent, surrendering to the heat and the dust and the crushing weight of his solitude. It was near dusk when they finally arrived. The ranch was not a ranch in the way she had imagined. There was no sprawling, welcoming house, no sign of life beyond a few chickens scratching in the dirt. There was only a small, modest cabin built of rough-hewn logs, a sturdy-looking barn, and a web of corrals. The whole place seemed to be braced against the wind, which swept constantly across the open land, making the grass whisper and the eaves of the cabin moan a low, lonely tune. It was a place of profound isolation. Calder dismounted and began to untie her trunk, his movements efficient and devoid of any ceremony. "The house has 2 rooms," he stated, not looking at her. "The one on the left is yours. Water's in the basin. I'll be in the barn." He hauled her trunk onto the porch with a heavy thud, leaving it there for her to manage. He did not touch her, did not help her down from the horse, did not offer a single word to ease her entry into this new life. He simply took the reins of both horses and disappeared into the dim, cavernous mouth of the barn, leaving her alone on the porch of the loneliest house she had ever seen. Evelyn dragged the trunk inside. The main room was sparse, dominated by a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table, and 2 chairs. A door on the left led to her room, which contained a narrow bed with an iron frame and a small chest of drawers. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, leather, and something else, the clean, sharp smell of the man who lived here. It was everywhere, in the very walls of the house, a constant reminder of his presence and his distance. She did not unpack. She simply sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the silence, which was different here. It was not the tense, watchful silence of the trail, but a deep, abiding emptiness that seemed to soak into her bones. She could hear the lonely cry of the wind and, faintly, the sounds of Calder moving about in the barn. He was choosing the company of animals over hers. Later, as darkness fell completely, she crept to the window and looked out. There was no light from the barn. The moon had not yet risen, and the land was a sea of blackness, vast and intimidating. The sheer, overwhelming loneliness of the place washed over her in a suffocating wave. She had traded one prison for another. She crawled under the quilt on the bed, not bothering to undress. It was heavy, and it smelled of him, that same scent of smoke and leather. She buried her face in the pillow to muffle the sound and began to cry. The tears came silently, hot trails down her temples into her hair. Her body ached from the long ride, a deep, bruising soreness in her muscles and bones. But it was her heart that hurt the most, a dull, relentless ache of regret. She had traveled halfway across the country, chasing a fragile sliver of hope, only to find herself more alone than she had ever been. She had run so far, but she had not outrun herself. The scent of liquor, thick and sweet on his breath, a smell that turned her stomach, the glint of the lamp on the shards of the broken mirror, scattered like jagged stars across the floorboards. His face, twisted in a snarl of rage, looming over her. The sound of his voice, not words, just a guttural roar of possession and fury. Then the sharp, searing pain in her arm as he grabbed her. His fingers digging in like claws. She had twisted away, scrambling backwards, her hand closing around something cold and sharp on the floor, a large piece of the broken mirror. He lunged again, and she had raised her hand. A desperate, blind defense. A different sound then. A wet, tearing noise, followed by a choked gasp. And then the blood. So much blood. It was dark, almost black in the dim light, covering her hands, her dress, the floor. It was on her hands, sticky and warm. The life of another man. A man who had promised to love her. She had not stayed to see if he lived or died. She had only run. Evelyn woke with a start, her own small gasp lost in the darkness of the room. The dream still clung to her, the phantom smell of whiskey and blood in the air. Her hands were fisted in the quilt, and her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She lay there for a long time, listening to the wind, until the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the cabin walls. The next morning, she forced herself to move. She would not be a useless burden. She would earn her keep. She found the kitchen supplies in a small pantry off the main room, a sack of flour, coffee, some salt pork. She built up the fire in the hearth and set about trying to make breakfast. Her hands trembled as she worked, and she felt clumsy and out of place. The quiet of the house was unnerving. She was mixing a batch of biscuit dough when the cabin door opened, and Calder stepped inside. He moved with a surprising quietness for such a large man. He stopped just inside the doorway, his presence filling the small space. He watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable in the dim morning light. Evelyn's hands froze in the bowl. He said nothing, simply moved toward the hearth to pour himself a cup of coffee from the pot she had set to boil. As he reached past her for a tin pan hanging from a hook on the wall, his arm brushed her shoulder. The contact was slight, accidental, but she flinched away as if she had been struck. It was a sharp, involuntary jerk of her body, a reaction born of old terrors. He stopped, his hand hovering in the air. He had noticed. She saw it in the sudden stillness of his body, in the way his gaze dropped to her. Sharp and assessing. The air grew thick and heavy. She waited for the question, for the anger, for the accusation. It did not come. He simply took the pan, his movements deliberate now, and turned away. He did not speak of it. He cooked his salt pork in silence, ate it standing by the fireplace, and then left the cabin without a word, disappearing back into the solitude of his barn and his fields. Evelyn was left alone with her shaking hands and the bitter taste of fear in her mouth. Later that morning, a visitor arrived. A wagon pulled up to the cabin, and a stout, middle-aged woman in a calico dress climbed down. She approached the porch with a proprietary air, a basket covered with a checkered cloth hooked over her arm. "Hello there," she called out, her voice overly bright. "You must be the new Mrs. Reed. I am Martha Albright from the neighboring ranch. Just came to welcome you to the valley." Evelyn stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Albright." Mrs. Albright's eyes swept over Evelyn, a quick, thorough inspection that missed nothing. "Oh, please, dear, call me Martha. We are all simple folk out here." She held out the basket. "Brought you some fresh bread. A man like Calder isn't likely to be much of a baker." Her smile was wide, but it did not reach her eyes, which were small and sharp. "That is very kind of you," Evelyn said, taking the basket. "It is the Christian thing to do," Martha said, settling herself into one of the two chairs on the porch as if she owned it. "Especially for a girl in your situation. It must be so difficult, starting over in a new place, with so much gossip flying about. You poor dear thing." The woman's sympathy was a sharp knife wrapped in soft cloth. Evelyn stood frozen, the basket clutched in her hands. Folks in town do love to talk. "Mrs. Albright continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They have no charity, none at all. The things they are saying about what happened back in St. Louis, it is just dreadful. But I told my Henry, I said, a woman does not end up in that kind of trouble without a reason. A man must have driven her to it." Each word was a carefully placed stone, walling Evelyn in. She felt the blood drain from her face. She wanted to order the woman to leave, but her voice was trapped in her throat. At that moment, Calder emerged from the barn. He walked toward the house with long, purposeful strides, his face set like granite. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at Mrs. Albright. His gray eyes were cold as ice. "Martha," he said, his voice flat. Mrs. Albright's smile faltered. "Calder, I was just welcoming your new bride." "She's welcomed," he said. He did not raise his voice, but the finality in his tone was unmistakable. "You've got fences that need mending on your north pasture." It was a dismissal, blunt and absolute. A flush crept up Martha Albright's neck. She stood abruptly, her sweet facade crumbling to reveal the hard resentment beneath. "Well, I can see when I am not wanted." She gave Evelyn one last, lingering look, her eyes filled with a venomous pity. Then she marched back to her wagon and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and poisonous silence behind her. Evelyn was shaking. The woman's words echoed in her head, confirming her worst fears. The scandal had followed her. It was a brand on her soul that everyone could see. Calder did not come up to the porch. He stood by the steps, his back to her, looking out at the endless, empty land. He had heard, he must have heard. He found her later, by the side of the cabin, where she had fled to weep in private. She was huddled against the rough logs, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She did not hear him approach. He simply stood a few feet away, a tall, silent shadow against the harsh afternoon light. He did not try to touch her, did not offer a word of comfort. He just waited. Finally, she gathered the courage to speak, to ask the question that had been tormenting her since she first saw the judgment in his eyes. She lifted her tear-stained face to his. "Do you believe what they say?" she whispered, her voice raw. "Do you believe what she said about me?" He looked at her, his face as unreadable as ever. The silence stretched on, and in it, her hope withered and died. She expected him to turn away, to leave her with the unspoken condemnation, but he did not. He held her gaze, and a flicker of something she could not name moved in the depths of his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, like the scrape of rock on rock. "I've heard worse." It was not the answer she wanted. It was not a denial, not a defense. It was nothing. And yet, it was something. It was a truth, his truth, and it left her with no comfort, only a deeper, more chilling uncertainty. He turned then and walked away, leaving her with the weight of his words. That evening, Evelyn watched the sunset alone. The sky bled out in brilliant, violent streaks of orange and purple, a beautiful, lonely death of a day. The wind whispered through the dry grass, a sound like 1,000 secrets being told at once. She wrapped her arms around herself, a poor substitute for the comfort she craved. She had run to the edge of the world to escape her past, only to find it waiting for her. She was tied to a man of stone and silence, in a town that hated her, in a land that did not care. She looked out at the vast, darkening horizon, and a small, desperate prayer escaped her lips, a whisper carried away on the lonely wind. "Please," she breathed into the twilight. "Please let this be different." The days that followed settled into a rhythm of silence and labor. From the first light of dawn until the sun bled out across the horizon, Calder worked. He moved with a relentless, punishing energy, as if he could beat the stubborn land into submission through sheer force of will. He mended fences, his hammer blows echoing in the vast quiet. He cleared rocks from a new patch of ground he intended to plow, heaving stones as large as a man's chest, the muscles in his back and arms cording with the strain. He was a solitary figure, a man who seemed more at home in the company of the wind and the dirt than with another human being. Evelyn watched him from the cabin, a prisoner of its four walls. She cooked and cleaned, turning the small, sparse house into a place of order. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed, washed their few linens until they smelled of lye and sunshine, and prepared meals that he ate with a silent, mechanical efficiency. The work was a blessing. It kept her hands busy and her mind from dwelling on the whispers of Dry Creek and the ghosts of St. Louis. But it was not enough. She felt like a housekeeper, a paid servant, not a wife. She was a spectator to his life, not a participant. One afternoon, she saw him struggling to reset a heavy post for a new corral. He had a rope looped around it, trying to leverage it into the deep hole he had dug, but the angle was wrong, and the post was too heavy. He grunted with the effort, his face dark with frustration. She could not stand to watch any longer. Wiping her hands on her apron, she walked out to him, the sun hot on her head. "Let me help," she said, her voice steady. "If I take the rope and pull from the other side, it should give you the balance you need." He stopped, breathing heavily, and looked at her. Sweat dripped from his temples, tracing lines through the grime on his face. His pale eyes were narrowed against the glare. "Go back to the house," he said, his voice a low rasp. "I can help," she insisted, stepping closer. "I am stronger than I look." "I said, go back to the house," he repeated, his voice harder this time. Rest. It is what you are here for. The words stung, though she could not tell if they were meant as an insult or a strange, misguided form of care. He did not trust her strength. Or perhaps, she thought with a sudden, bitter clarity, he did not want to need her. To need her would be to admit she had a place here, a purpose beyond cooking his meals and warming a bed he had not yet approached. He was a man determined to be an island, and he would not suffer her to be a bridge. She turned without another word and walked back to the cabin, the silence he insisted upon now feeling like a deliberate and personal rejection. The tension brewed between them for days, a storm gathering just over the horizon. It was in the air, thick and heavy like the heat before a summer squall. It was in the way he avoided her eyes at supper, in the rigid set of her shoulders as she served him his food. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with unspoken resentments and frustrations. The small cabin seemed to shrink around them, until there was nowhere left to retreat. It broke on a Tuesday. Supper was a meager affair of beans and cornbread. They ate in the usual silence, the only sounds the scrape of forks against the tin plates. Evelyn could not bear it another moment. She set her fork down with a sharp clatter that made him look up. "Why did you send for me?" she asked, her voice trembling with a week's worth of held-back emotion. His eyes, hooded and wary, gave nothing away. "I needed a wife." "No," she said, shaking her head, the word a small, desperate explosion. "You needed a housekeeper, a cook. You did not need a wife. You needed a ghost to move about your house so you would not have to feel so alone, but you will not even grant me that. You will not speak to me. You will not look at me. I am just another piece of furniture to you, something to be dusted and ignored." He said nothing, his jaw tightening. His continued silence was a lash. "I have left everything I have ever known to come here," she went on, her voice rising. "I have traveled 1,000 miles to be your wife, and you treat me as if I am a disease you have been forced to quarantine. If you despise me so much, if the stories you have heard have turned you so completely against me, then why did you let me stay?" His face, which had been a mask of stoicism, suddenly contorted. A dark, terrifying emotion flared in his eyes. It was not just anger. It was a deep, scalding rage that seemed to come from a place of profound pain. He stood so abruptly that his chair scraped back, threatening to topple over. "You know nothing," he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl that she had not heard before. Before she could react, he brought his hand down, not on the table, not on her, but on the tin plate that sat before him. He did not slap it. He closed his fist around its edge and squeezed. The metal groaned, bent, and then he simply crushed it, his knuckles white with the strain. The violence of the act was shocking. A sudden, brutal crack in his wall of control. He stared at the mangled plate in his hand, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his eyes wide with something that looked like horror at his own action. Then, just as quickly as it had come, the rage was gone, replaced by a shuttered, dead look. He dropped the ruined plate onto the table with a loud clatter, without another word, without another glance at her. He turned and strode out of the cabin, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed in the sudden, ringing silence. Evelyn was left alone, her heart hammering against her ribs, her body trembling from a fear that was old and sickeningly familiar. He did not return that night. Evelyn lay awake in her bed for hours, listening to the lonely sounds of the prairie, her ears straining for the sound of his footsteps. She finally drifted into a fitful, dream-plagued sleep, but she was not truly resting. It was well after midnight when she heard the cabin door creak open. She sat bolt upright in bed, her heart leaping into her throat. She heard his heavy, unsteady footsteps cross the main room. He did not light a lamp. He moved in the darkness, a large, unseen presence. She heard him stop outside her door. A smell, faint at first, then stronger, seeped under the door. Whiskey. The scent hit her like a physical blow, throwing her back into the darkest corners of her memory. It was the smell of violence, of pain, of broken promises. She pulled the quilt up to her chin, her knuckles white, her body rigid with a terror that was absolute. She waited, scarcely breathing, for the handle to turn. He stood there for what felt like an eternity. She could almost feel his presence through the wood of the door, a vortex of darkness and sorrow. There was a strange and terrible conflict warring within her. Part of her was paralyzed with a primal fear of the man on the other side of that door. A man who had shown her his rage and now smelled of the liquor that had fueled her first husband's cruelty. But another, smaller part of her, a part she could not understand, felt a pull toward his pain. She desired not him, but the comfort he so clearly lacked, a comfort she did not know how to give. She was trapped between dread and a strange, nascent desire to soothe the beast she had seen. He never touched the door. After a long, silent moment, she heard him move away, his footsteps receding. A soft thud told her he had slumped into the chair by the cold hearth. She stayed awake for the rest of the night, listening to the sound of his ragged breathing, a sentinel at the gates of her own fear. The next day, a new sound came, a low, mournful rumble in the distance. The sky, which had been a sheet of pale, washed-out blue for as long as she had been there, was now bruised with dark. Heavy clouds gathering on the western horizon. The air grew thick and still, charged with an electric tension that mirrored the atmosphere inside the cabin. By late afternoon, the storm rolled in. The first drops of rain hit the tin roof like a scattering of pebbles, and then the heavens opened. It was a deluge, a solid, gray sheet of water that blurred the landscape and turned the dusty yard into a sea of mud. The sound was deafening, a constant, roaring tattoo against the roof. And then came the thunder. It started as a low growl, a vibration she felt deep in her chest. Then it came again, closer this time, a great, tearing crack that seemed to split the sky in two, followed by a long, booming echo that rolled across the plains. At the first crack of thunder, Evelyn cried out, a small, involuntary sound. Her hands flew to her ears, her carefully constructed composure shattered. For her, thunder was not just a sound. It was the roar of an angry man, the sound that had always come before the fists. It was the sound of walls shaking, of glass breaking, of her own pleading screams being drowned out by a force of nature she could not fight. Another crash, louder this time. Directly overhead, a flash of lightning illuminated the cabin for a split second, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping hands. She could not breathe. The room was closing in on her. She could not stay in her room, could not stay alone with the roaring ghosts the storm had unleashed. On pure, unthinking instinct, she fled. She scrambled from her bed and ran into the main room, her bare feet cold on the wooden floor. Calder was there, just as he had been the night before. Slumped in the armchair by the fireplace, the room was dark, save for the weak gray light filtering through the window. He was dozing, his head lolled to one side, his face etched with exhaustion. She stopped in the middle of the room, her flight cut short by his presence. She did not know what to do. She had run to him for a safety he had never offered. At the next clap of thunder, she whimpered, a sound like a wounded animal, and huddled down where she stood, wrapping her arms around her knees. The sound woke him. His head snapped up, and he was instantly alert, the way a predator wakes. He peered at her through the gloom, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. He saw her there, a small, trembling bundle on his floor. He did not speak, just watched her. His face was a mask of shadows, impossible to read. I am sorry, she stammered, her teeth chattering. The thunder. He did not get up. He did not move toward her. He simply looked at her, his gaze steady. And then he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward the other chair. the one across the hearth from his. It was not an invitation spoken aloud, but it was an offering of sanctuary, permission to stay. She scrambled into the chair, pulling her feet up under her thin nightdress. She huddled deep into it, as far from him as she could get while still being in the same room. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, a strange, fragile truce had formed. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the rain and the thunder. It was a different kind of silence than before. It was not a wall between them, but a shared space, a small pocket of quiet carved out of the heart of the storm. It was Calder who finally broke it. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, barely louder than the sound of the rain. It reminds me of the cannons. Evelyn looked at him. In the dim light, his face looked younger, and the lines of tension around his mouth had softened. "The war?" she whispered. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the empty, cold fireplace. "Sometimes, not the sound so much. The smell, after a battle, the smell of rain on hot metal, and blood, and other things." He paused, his throat working. "There was a boy, from Ohio, barely old enough to shave. He was scared of the dark, used to talk all night just to keep it away. We were pinned down in a farmhouse near Shiloh. The shelling went on for 2 days. When it finally stopped," he trailed off, his eyes unfocused, seeing a scene she could not imagine. "There was a fire. He was screaming. I can still smell it sometimes. The rain and the smoke and the smell of him burning." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and terrible. He had given her a piece of his pain, a shard of the thing that had hollowed him out. She saw now that his silence was not an absence of feeling, but a prison for it. Without thinking, she reached out across the space between their chairs and hesitantly touched his hand, the one that rested on the arm of his chair. It was the hand he had crushed the plate with. His skin was warm and rough beneath her fingertips. He flinched at her touch, but he did not pull away. Her own fear, deep-seated and reflexive, surged back. She was touching him. She was touching the hand that had shown such violence. She snatched her hand back as if she had been burned, her heart pounding. "Promise me," she whispered, the words tumbling out of her, a desperate plea torn from the deepest part of her soul. "Promise me you will not hurt me." He turned his head and looked at her. His gray eyes were clear, and for the first time, she felt he was truly seeing her. Not the scandal she represented, not the burden she might be, but the terrified woman huddled in his chair. His voice, when he replied, was so soft it was almost lost in the sound of the storm. "Not unless you ask me to." The next morning, the storm had passed. A clean, washed light filled the cabin. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. Calder was already up, stoking the fire. Evelyn emerged from her room to find him staring into the flames, a dirty rag wrapped around his right hand. "Let me see that," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He looked at her, then down at his hand, as if noticing it for the first time. "It is nothing." "It is not nothing," she insisted, moving toward him. "You will get an infection. Sit." To her surprise, he obeyed. He sat at the table, and she brought a basin of warm water and some clean strips of cloth. She sat opposite him and gently took his hand. He tensed, but allowed her to hold it. She carefully unwrapped the rag. The cuts on his palm and fingers were deep, angry red lines against his calloused skin, souvenirs from his battle with the tin plate. She worked in silence, cleaning the wound with a gentle, focused touch. His hand was large and powerful in hers, capable of such destruction, yet he held it perfectly still, surrendering it to her care. The closeness between them was a fragile, palpable thing. It was in the warmth of his skin against hers, in the soft sound of her breathing, in the way his eyes followed her every movement. It was an intimacy that went deeper than words, a silent communication of trust and care that was as new and delicate as the morning light. They were interrupted by the sound of an approaching horse. A few moments later, a man appeared at the open cabin door. He was of average height, with a self-important posture and a drooping mustache. A silver star was pinned to his vest. "Read," the man said, his voice carrying an easy authority. He did not wait for an invitation, but stepped inside, his eyes immediately finding Evelyn. He looked her up and down with a gaze that was both suspicious and vaguely insulting. "I'm Deputy Travis. Sheriff sent me out to check on you folks after the storm." Calder's body had gone rigid. He slowly pulled his hand from Evelyn's. "We are fine," he said, his voice flat and cold. Deputy Travis's gaze lingered on Evelyn. "Heard you had some company," he said, a slight smirk playing on his lips. "Word gets around. A woman with a certain kind of reputation can bring a certain kind of trouble with her. We run a quiet town here. Read. We aim to keep it that way." The veiled threat was unmistakable. He was not there to check on them. He was there to deliver a warning. Calder rose slowly from his chair, his height seeming to diminish the deputy. He moved to stand between Travis and Evelyn, a silent, immovable shield. "This is my wife," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And this is my land. The only trouble here is the kind you bring with you. Do not come back here unless you are invited." The deputy's smirk faltered. He held Calder's icy gaze for a long moment, then seemed to decide it was a fight he could not win. He shrugged, a theatrical gesture of nonchalance. "Just doing my job. Read." He tipped his hat in a mockery of politeness and backed out of the cabin. After he was gone, the fragile peace of the morning was shattered. Calder stood staring out the door for a long time, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was a fortress again, the walls back up, higher and stronger than before. That night, Evelyn found a small, leather-bound book at the bottom of her trunk. A gift from her mother that she had forgotten was there. Its pages were blank. She took out the small pencil she kept with it and, by the light of a single candle, she began to write. She did not write about what had happened, not in detail. Instead, she wrote about the color of the sky after the storm, and the feel of Calder's hand in hers, and the fear that lived in her heart like a constant, unwelcome guest. It was a small act, done in secret, but it felt like an act of rebellion. It was her voice, a place where she could not be silenced, a way of reclaiming the pieces of herself that she feared were being lost. A few days later, as she was sweeping the porch, Calder approached her. He had been shoeing one of the horses and smelled of sweat and hot metal. He stopped before her, holding his hat in his hands. "I have to ride into town for supplies," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "You should come." Evelyn's heart gave a small, hopeful leap. It was not a request, it was a statement, but it was an inclusion. After days of renewed silence following the deputy's visit, it was an olive branch. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I would like that." The ride to town was quiet, but it was a different quiet than before. It was not the cold, hostile silence of their first journey. It was a comfortable quiet, a space they shared instead of a chasm that divided them. Evelyn rode beside him this time, not behind. The sun was warm on her back, and the air was clean and fresh. She watched his profile against the vast, open sky, the strong line of his jaw, the distant look in his pale eyes. She wondered what secrets he kept locked behind that silence, what other ghosts from his past kept him company in the long, lonely nights. For the first time since she had arrived in this harsh, unforgiving land, she felt a flicker of something she had thought long dead. It was a fragile, tentative thing, but it was there. It was hope. The hope she had felt on the ride to Dry Creek was a fragile thing, a wildflower blooming in a rock fissure, and it withered the moment they dismounted. The town had not forgotten her. The moment Evelyn's boots touched the dusty street, she felt the change in the atmosphere. Conversations on the boardwalk stuttered and died. Heads turned. The air grew thick with a current of malice she could feel as surely as she could feel the heat of the sun. The whispers started again, a low, sibilant rustle that followed them like a swarm of unseen insects. She walked beside Calder, her back straight, her chin held high in a lonely pantomime of dignity. She kept her eyes fixed on the entrance to the general store, refusing to meet the gazes that she knew were dissecting her, judging the worn fabric of her dress, the weariness in her face, the very air she breathed. As they passed a small group of women clustered near the assayer's office. One of them, a woman with a face pinched by a sour piety, turned and spat on the ground. A deliberate, contemptuous act. The gob of saliva landed a mere inch from the toe of Evelyn's boot. Evelyn flinched, a sharp, involuntary jerk, and stopped dead in her tracks. The heat of shame and fury washed over her, so intense it made her dizzy. She did not have to face it alone. Calder, who had been a half-step ahead of her, stopped as well. He did not turn to confront the woman. He did not say a word. He simply took one step to his left, a small, almost imperceptible shift of his body that placed him squarely between Evelyn and the women. He stood there for a single, silent moment, a human shield, his broad back an unbreachable wall. His silence was more powerful than any shout, a cold, absolute condemnation that made the women avert their eyes and hurry away, their whispers now flustered and defensive. He did not look at Evelyn. He simply started walking again, and she fell into step beside him, moving in the shelter of his shadow. The inside of the general store smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and dust. A pot-bellied man with a sweaty brow and spectacles perched on the end of his nose stood behind the counter. He was Mr. Henderson, the proprietor. His gaze flicked from Calder to Evelyn, and a look of sour disapproval settled on his face. Calder handed him a list. "Need these things, Henderson." The storekeeper took the list, his eyes still on Evelyn. He began to gather the items: flour, sugar, coffee, salt, moving with a slow, deliberate reluctance. While he worked, Evelyn wandered over to a small display of fabric bolts, her fingers itching to touch the colorful calicos and soft flannels, a new dress, one that was not gray and stained with travel, felt like an impossible luxury. But perhaps she could afford a small piece for an apron, something to bring a little color into the drabness of the cabin. She selected a simple blue and white checkered cotton and brought the bolt to the counter. "I would like 2 yards of this, please," she said, her voice quiet. Mr. Henderson stopped what he was doing and looked at the fabric, then at her. He pushed his spectacles up his nose. "We are not selling fabric today," he said, his voice flat. Evelyn blinked. "But it is on display." "My store, my rules," he said, turning his back on her to weigh out a bag of beans. "Not selling it." The rejection was so blunt, so public. It stole the air from her lungs. It was not about the fabric. It was about her. She was a contagion, a stain, and he would not have her touching his merchandise. She felt the eyes of the few other customers in the store on her, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. She was about to retreat, to swallow the humiliation and fade back into the shadows, when Calder moved. He set down the sack of flour he was holding and stepped up to the counter beside her. He did not look at the storekeeper. He looked at Evelyn. "Is this the one you want?" he asked, his voice low and even. She could only nod, her throat tight with unshed tears. He turned to Henderson. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of coins, not placing them on the counter, but slamming them down. The loud, metallic crack echoed through the silent store. The coins jumped and settled. It was far more than the fabric was worth. "The lady," Calder said, his voice dangerously quiet, "wants 2 yards of the blue and white cotton. Measure it. Wrap it. Now." Mr. Henderson flinched at the sound. He looked from Calder's face, which was a mask of cold fury, to the pile of coins, and then back again. A flicker of fear crossed his features. He was a man of commerce, but he was also a man who knew when he was outmatched. Without another word, he took the bolt of fabric, unrolled it on the counter, and measured out 2 yards with jerky, angry movements. He wrapped it in brown paper, tied it with twine, and pushed it toward Evelyn without meeting her eyes. Calder swept the rest of the coins back into his pocket, gathered their supplies, and walked out. Evelyn followed, clutching the small parcel to her chest as if it were a priceless treasure. It was not just fabric. It was a victory. It was the first time anyone had stood for her in a very, very long time. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but the silence had changed again. The tension was gone, replaced by a sense of shared experience, a small alliance forged in the face of the town's hostility. They rode side by side, the rhythm of the horses' hooves a steady, peaceful beat, as they passed a small, wind-swept cemetery on a low hill, marked by a few crooked wooden crosses. Calder slowed his horse. He stared at the lonely graves for a long moment, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. "My brother's buried in a place like this," he said, his voice so low that Evelyn had to strain to hear him over the wind. "In Tennessee, just a field, full of boys. No names on most of the markers." Evelyn's heart ached for him. She did not know what to say, so she said nothing, simply waiting for him to continue if he chose to. "He was younger than me," Calder went on, his gaze still fixed on the distant hill. 17. He wanted to be a hero, signed up the first chance he got. I followed, thinking I could watch out for him, keep him safe." He let out a short, harsh breath that was not quite a laugh. "He died in my arms, a piece of shrapnel. There was nothing I could do. I just held him, and I walked away. They called me a hero for the things I did after that, but all I did was survive." He fell silent then, but he had given her a precious gift. It was a small key, a glimpse into the locked room of his past, an explanation for the profound and abiding sorrow in his eyes. He was a man haunted by the ghost of a boy he could not save, a man who believed his own survival was a kind of failure. He nudged his horse forward, and they rode the rest of the way home in a silence that was now filled with a shared, unspoken understanding. That evening, a comfortable quiet settled over the cabin. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow on the rough-hewn walls, while Calder cleaned his rifle at the table, his movements precise and economical. Evelyn sat in the chair by the fire. She had taken out one of his work shirts, one with a long tear in the sleeve, and was carefully mending it. She worked with a focused intensity, her needle dipping in and out of the coarse fabric. Each stitch was a small, deliberate act of care, a way of saying the things she could not speak aloud. She was mending his shirt, but it felt as if she were trying to mend something larger, something in the house, in him, in herself. She was aware of him watching her. She did not have to look up to know. She could feel his gaze on her, steady and quiet in the firelight. He said nothing, but his attention was a tangible thing, a weight in the air that was not unpleasant. It made her fingers tremble slightly as she tied off the thread. For the first time, she felt his silence, not as a rejection, but as a form of contemplation. He was studying her, trying to figure her out, just as she was trying to figure him out. Later, after she had retired to her room, she lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the house settling. She heard him bank the fire for the night, heard the scrape of his chair as he pushed it back from the table. She heard his footsteps cross the main room, and then they stopped. They stopped outside her door. Her heart began to beat a little faster, but this time there was no smell of whiskey, no sense of menace, just his silent presence on the other side of the door. She waited. The doorknob turned. The door creaked open, and he stepped inside, a dark silhouette against the dim, ember glow from the other room. He was holding something in his hand. As he moved closer to the bed, the faint light caught it, and a cold wave of dread washed over her. It was her journal. She sat bolt upright, clutching the quilt to her chest. He had found it. He had read it. The thought was a violation so profound it made her feel physically ill. The one private place she had, the one corner of her world that was hers and hers alone, had been invaded. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice a choked, furious tremor. All the fragile trust that had been built between them that day crumbled into dust. "How dare you?" He stopped a few feet from the bed. He did not look ashamed. His face, what she could see of it in the gloom, was etched with a deep, somber gravity. "I had to," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I needed to know." "Know what?" she cried, her voice rising. "You needed to know my private thoughts, my fears. You had no right." "I needed to know if you feared me," he said, and the raw honesty in his voice cut through her anger. "I see the way you look at me sometimes, the way you flinched when I reached for that pan, the way you looked when you smelled the whiskey on me. I see a fear in you that is older than me, older than this place. I had to understand it." The confrontation she had been dreading, the one she had run 1,000 miles to avoid, was finally upon them. All the secrets she had guarded so fiercely were about to be torn from her, but looking at his face, at the genuine, painful uncertainty in his eyes, she realized he was not her enemy. He was just another soul, as lost and as haunted as she was. The fury drained out of her, leaving behind only a vast, aching emptiness. The truth was all she had left. "You want to know what I fear?" she said, her voice dropping to a raw, ragged whisper. The words began to tumble out, clumsy and painful, like stones being pulled from a deep, infected wound. "I fear the smell of liquor on a man's breath. I fear the sound of a raised voice, the weight of a heavy hand. I fear being trapped in a room with a man who believes that because he gave me his name, he owns my body and my soul." She took a shaky breath, the memories washing over her. "My first husband," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth, "was a respected man in St. Louis. He was charming to his friends and brutal to his wife. He beat me. Not every day, just often enough so that I never forgot that I was his property. The night I left him, he came home drunk and angry. He broke a mirror, and then he broke my arm. I defended myself. I picked up a piece of the broken glass and I cut him. I ran, and I did not look back. They found me 2 days later. He told them I had attacked him in a jealous rage. They put me in jail. A society for the aid of destitute women arranged for my release, on the condition that I leave the city and never return. They are the ones who put me in touch with the marriage agency. They bought me a ticket and sent me west. They sent me to you." She was crying now, silent, hot tears tracking paths through the dust on her cheeks. She had said it all, the whole ugly, shameful story. She waited for the disgust, the condemnation, the final, absolute rejection. Calder did not move for a long moment. Then, slowly, he came to the side of the bed and sat on the edge. He placed her journal on the small bedside table. He did not look at her at first, but at his own large, scarred hands. "I have never," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she could not name, "wanted to touch someone so bad and been so scared of doing it wrong." He turned his head and looked at her then. The sorrow in his eyes was so deep it threatened to drown her. He slowly, hesitantly, raised a hand and gently cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking the line of her cheek. His touch was not possessive or demanding. It was a question. And in that moment, she knew she had been wrong. She did not fear him. She feared the ghosts he resembled, but not the man himself. She leaned into his touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it was enough. He leaned in, his face blocking out the dim light, and he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was hesitant, almost painful, a collision of two lonely, desperate mouths. It was a kiss that tasted of salt from her tears and a sorrow so profound it had no words. It spoke of shared pain, of silent understanding, of a desperate, terrifying hope. Her body, so long braced for pain, responded with a will of its own. A deep, forgotten longing unfurled within her, a craving for a tenderness she had never known. But as the kiss deepened, as he shifted his weight to bring her closer, a tremor went through her. It started deep in her belly and radiated outward, an involuntary shudder of old, remembered terror. Her body was betraying her heart, screaming a warning that her mind was trying to ignore. He felt it. He stopped immediately. He pulled back, his breath ragged, his eyes searching her face in the darkness. He saw the fear that had returned to her eyes, the way she was trembling, and he understood. He did not push, he did not demand. He did something she never would have expected. He stood up, took the heavy quilt from the foot of her bed, and gently wrapped it around her trembling shoulders. Then he pulled the second chair from the main room, placed it beside her bed, and sat down. He did not touch her again. He just sat there, a silent, watchful guardian in the darkness, offering her the one thing no one else ever had, the safety of his presence, without the pressure of his desire. The next day, something had shifted between them. It was a subtle change, an unspoken acknowledgement that the ground beneath their feet had been irrevocably altered. A wariness was still there, a caution born of old wounds, but now it was tangled with a fragile, burgeoning longing. Evelyn found him outside at dawn, repairing a section of fence with a furious, focused energy she had not seen in him before. The blows of his hammer were harder, the movements of his body more fluid, as if some great weight had been lifted from his shoulders, freeing him to move in the world in a new way. Later that afternoon, the heat was oppressive, the air thick and still. "The river is high enough for bathing," Calder said, his back to her as he cleaned a saddle. It was not a question, but a statement of fact, an offering. They walked to the river together, a small, slow-moving current of surprisingly clear water shaded by a grove of cottonwood trees. There was an unspoken agreement between them. He went upstream, disappearing behind a thicket of willows, while she went downstream, finding a small, secluded pool. She slipped out of her dress and waded into the cool water. It was a baptism, washing away the dust of the trail, the grime of the town, the lingering ghosts of the night before. As she bathed, she looked upstream, through a gap in the leaves. She could see him. He was standing waist-deep in the water, his back to her. His back was a roadmap of his life. It was broad and powerfully muscled, but it was marred by scars. Some were thin and white, old and faded, but one, a puckered, angry-looking scar high on his left shoulder, looked newer. It was the mark of a bullet or a piece of shrapnel, a souvenir from the war he had survived. They were the marks of a man who had known violence, who had carried it on his own body. She pressed a hand to her own side, to the place where a faint, silvery scar marked the memory of a broken rib. She thought of the other scars, the ones on the inside that no one could see. She looked at his scarred back, a testament to his pain, and touched her own, a testament to hers. She wondered, in the quiet, sun-dappled sanctuary of the river, if they matched. The wall of silence between them did not crumble overnight. It eroded, slowly and patiently, like a sandstone cliff under a persistent river. They began to work the ranch not as two separate individuals occupying the same space, but as a unit, a team. A rhythm developed between them, a silent language spoken in shared labor. When he was digging post holes, she would bring him a dipper of cool water before he had to ask. When she was tending her small, struggling garden, he would appear with a heavier bucket of water than she could manage, set it down, and walk away without a word. The silences at the dinner table were no longer heavy with tension. They were softer, filled with the comfortable weariness that comes from a day of hard work under an unforgiving sun. Sometimes, a small observation would pass between them. "Sky looks like it might hold more rain," he would say, and she would nod. "The corn is starting to come up," she would offer, and he would grunt in acknowledgement. They were small things, but they were not nothing. They were the first tentative shoots of green in a land that had been barren for too long. This fragile peace was shattered by news that drifted in from town on the back of a horse. A neighboring rancher, a man named Silas Croft, stopped by on his way back from Dry Creek, his face grim. "Trouble in town. Calder," he said, not dismounting. "They found the Miller boy this morning, down by the creek." Calder, who had been tightening a saddle strap, stopped his work. "Found him how?" Silas Croft spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Strung up from a cottonwood. Been there all night. Looks like folks are saying it was revenge." Evelyn, who had come out onto the porch, felt a cold dread snake its way up her spine. "Revenge for what?" she asked, her voice small. The rancher looked at her, his eyes holding a mixture of pity and caution. "The boy was known to be sweet on one of the saloon girls. Ma'am, a Mexican girl. Her brother was run out of town a few weeks back by Deputy Travis and some others, accused of cheating at cards. The boy stood up for him, spoke out of turn. Some folks don't take kindly to that." After Silas had ridden on, a heavy, sick silence descended on the ranch. The air, which had been clean and bright, now felt tainted. Evelyn could see the scene in her mind. A dark and terrible tableau under the cold light of the moon. A boy, barely a man, paying the ultimate price for a small act of decency. And she could see another face in her mind, the face of Deputy Travis, with his cruel, smirking mouth and his eyes full of a petty, self-satisfied authority. That night, as they sat by the fire, the image of the boy and the sneer of the deputy would not leave her. She could not stay silent. "It was him," she said softly, her hands clenched in her lap. "It was Deputy Travis. He and his friends." Calder looked up from the harness he was mending, his face impassive. "You do not know that." "I do," she insisted, her voice gaining a desperate conviction. "I know that kind of man, the kind who enjoys cruelty, who wraps it up in the flag of order and calls it justice. He warned us. He warned me. He said my kind brings trouble." "And stirring this up will bring more," Calder said, his voice a low warning. "This is not our fight. Evelyn, keep your head down. Stay out of it." His words were meant to be practical, a cold dose of survivor's wisdom, but they felt like a betrayal. They felt like the silence he had once used to wall himself off from the world. She looked at him, at this man who had stood for her in the general store, and saw him retreating back into the safety of his fortress. "It becomes our fight when we stay silent," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Injustice is the only thing that stirs itself. It does not need my help. It only needs my silence to grow." He said nothing more, his face grim, his hands stilling on the leather strap. He had closed himself off again, and the distance between their two chairs felt as wide as the prairie. Later that night, she lay in her bed, listening to the lonely cry of a coyote. The cruelty of the world felt like a physical weight, a suffocating presence in the dark. The memory of the Miller boy, the sneer of the deputy, the cold fear in her own heart. It was all a poison, seeping into the fragile peace she had begun to find. She needed to feel something else. She needed to feel something that was not cruel, not hateful, not born of violence. She needed to feel something tender. She rose from her bed, her thin nightdress a ghostly white in the moonlight slanting through her window. She walked to her door, her heart hammering a wild, damned, uncertain rhythm against her ribs. This was her choice, her agency. It was not a surrender to a man's demands, but a reaching for a human connection in a world that seemed determined to crush it. She crossed the main room to his doorway. He was not yet asleep. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, his back to her, staring at the wall. He was so still he might have been carved from stone. She stood there for a long moment, her courage wavering. "Calder," she whispered. He turned his head slowly. In the dim light, she could see the surprise in his eyes, and something else, a deep, weary sadness. She walked into his room and stopped before him. She did not know the words to say what she needed, so she showed him. She reached out and gently took his face in her hands, her thumbs tracing the tense lines around his mouth. She leaned down and kissed him. It was a different kiss than the first one. It was not a desperate collision of pain, but a soft, tender offering. He did not respond at first, too stunned to move. Then, a low groan escaped his throat, and his hands came up to rest on her waist, his touch hesitant, uncertain. She pulled back and looked into his eyes, letting him see the truth in hers. There was no fear there now, only a raw, aching need. "I need," she started, her voice breaking. "I need this not to be ugly. I need to feel something good." Understanding dawned on his face. He stood up, his hands still on her waist, and simply held her for a long moment, his forehead resting against hers. Then he kissed her again. A slow, deep kiss that was full of a reverence that made her want to weep. He did not rush. He was a man unlearning a lifetime of solitude, and she was a woman unlearning a lifetime of fear. He undressed her slowly, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle against her skin. He did not turn away from her scars. Instead, he lingered on them. He traced the faint, silvery line on her side with his fingertips, his touch as soft as a prayer. He pressed a gentle kiss to a faded bruise on her shoulder that she had not even realized was still there. He was not just touching her body. He was reading her history, and he was not recoiling from what he found. He was accepting it. He was worshiping it. The love they made was a slow, quiet unfolding. It was more about trust than lust, more about healing than release. It was a silent conversation between two damaged souls, a language spoken in gentle touches and soft breaths. When she finally cried out, it was not a moan of pain, or even of pleasure in the way she had ever known it. It was a sound of surrender, a deep, shuddering release of a tension she had carried for years, the profound and overwhelming relief of feeling, for the first time in her life, completely and utterly safe in a man's arms. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, the moonlight painting silver stripes across their bodies. Calder's arm was a heavy, solid weight around her, anchoring her to the present. He was the one who broke the long, peaceful silence. "I killed a man once," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. He did not say it with pride or with shame, but with the flat, weary tone of a man stating a fact. It was not during the war. It was after, in a town in Kansas. She held her breath, waiting. "He was a blacksmith," Calder continued, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. "A big man, with hands like hammers. He was married to a woman, a small, quiet thing. He used to beat her. Everyone knew it. No one did anything. One night, I was passing their house. I heard her screaming. I went inside. He was hurting her. I told him to stop. He laughed. He came at me with a hammer." Calder's arm tightened around her. "I did not think. I just reacted. I took the hammer from him, and I used it. I buried him out on the prairie that night. She told everyone he had run off. I left the next day. I have never told anyone that. I was afraid they would see the same monster in me that I saw in him." Evelyn turned in his arms to face him. She looked into his eyes and saw not a monster, but a man who had carried a terrible burden in silence, just as she had. He had committed an act of violence, but it had been in defense of a woman who could not defend herself. His secret was a mirror of her own. She lifted a hand and gently touched the scar on his shoulder. "We are both ghosts," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We are both just ghosts, trying to learn how to breathe again." He pulled her closer, burying his face in her hair, and for the first time, in the shared darkness of their pasts, they were not alone. The fragile bubble of their newfound intimacy was burst a few days later by the arrival of Deputy Travis. He rode into the yard alone, his horse kicking up dust, and dismounted with a swagger that set Evelyn's teeth on edge. Calder met him on the porch, positioning himself in front of the door, a silent guardian. "Read," Travis said, his eyes flicking past Calder to where Evelyn stood in the doorway. His gaze was insolent, a greasy smear of a look that made her skin crawl. "Came to have a word with you about the trouble you are harboring." "There is no trouble here," Calder said, his voice a low, flat warning. Travis's mouth twisted into a smirk. "Is that right? Seems to me you have taken in a piece of damaged goods from St. Louis, and now we have got a boy strung up from a tree. I am starting to see a pattern. Bad things follow women like her." The insult, so casual, so cruel, was a physical blow. But before Evelyn could even react, Calder moved. It was not a thought-out action. It was a pure, visceral, protective reflex. He took one step off the porch and punched Deputy Travis squarely in the face. The sound was a sickening crack of bone and cartilage. Travis staggered backward, his hand flying to his face, his eyes wide with shocked disbelief. Blood gushed from his nose, a bright, shocking red against the dust of the yard. "Get off my land," Calder snarled, his voice a low, lethal growl. Travis, clutching his broken nose, scrambled back onto his horse and galloped away, leaving a trail of dust and threats behind him. The consequences were not long in coming. The next day, the sheriff himself rode out to the ranch. He was an older man, with a weary, resigned face. He did not even dismount. "Calder," he said, his voice tired. "Travis is a fool, and he likely got what he deserved, but he is a fool with a badge. You cannot go around breaking the noses of my deputies. The town is already on edge over this Miller boy business. I do not need you adding to it." He looked past Calder to Evelyn, and his eyes were not unkind, but they were deeply troubled. "I am getting an earful from the town council. They are saying this woman of yours is a disruption. They want her gone." Evelyn felt the world tilt under her feet. It was happening all over again. She was the problem. She was the burden. She was the source of all the fuss. "You keep to yourselves," the sheriff said, turning his horse. "You tell your wife to stay out of town. You cause one more bit of trouble, Calder, and I will have no choice but to lock you up. Do you understand me?" He rode away, leaving his words hanging in the air like a death sentence. Evelyn could not hold back the sob that tore from her throat. She sank down onto the porch steps and buried her face in her hands, the familiar, crushing weight of shame and despair washing over her. She was a curse. She brought trouble and pain wherever she went. A gentle rain began to fall, a soft, gray drizzle that matched the color of her mood. She felt a hand on her shoulder and looked up to see Calder standing over her. He knelt in front of her, the rain darkening his hair and shirt. He gently pulled her hands away from her face and looked into her eyes. "It is my fault," she wept. "I am a burden to you. I have brought all this down on you." "No," he said, his voice fierce. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. He leaned in and kissed her, a desperate, passionate kiss in the rain. It was a kiss that tasted of sorrow and defiance. "You are not a burden," he said, pulling back to look at her, his gray eyes blazing with an intensity she had never seen before. "You are the only thing keeping this place from falling apart. Before you came, this was just a house. You are the only thing that has ever made it feel like a home." He pulled her to her feet and led her inside. Out of the rain, the fire was low, casting long shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the scent of rain and wood smoke and a desperate, unspoken need. He kissed her again, and this time there was no gentle exploration. It was a rougher, more desperate claiming. It was a release of all the fear, all the anger, all the pain of the last few days. It was a frantic, primal craving, a need to affirm their connection in a world that was trying to sever it. They made love on the bearskin rug in front of the fire, a desperate, tangled union of two souls clinging to each other in a storm. Afterward, as she lay in his arms, her body aching and her heart raw, she began to sob. But they were not tears of sorrow or shame. They were tears of a profound and overwhelming catharsis. She was not crying because she had been hurt. She was crying because, for the first time in her entire life, she had been truly and completely seen. He had seen all of her, the scars, the shame, the fear, the fight, and he had not turned away. He had stood for her. He had fought for her, and he had loved her, not in spite of her broken pieces, but with them. The first sign of trouble was a smudge of angry red against the deep purple of the twilight sky. It was to the east, in the direction of the Croft Ranch. Calder saw it first. He was standing on the porch, his back to the house, a dark, still figure staring out at the horizon. Evelyn came to stand beside him, the evening air cool on her arms. "What is it?" she asked. "Fire," he said, his voice a low, flat line. "And it is a big one." Without another word, he went to the barn and saddled his horse. There was no question of him not going. Out here, a neighbor's fire was everyone's fire. He rode out at a hard gallop, a silhouette swallowed by the growing darkness, leaving Evelyn to watch the terrible, flickering glow that painted the underside of the clouds with a light like hellfire. He returned hours later, long after midnight, smelling of smoke and sweat. He was grim-faced and exhausted. He slumped into a chair at the table while Evelyn poured him a cup of coffee. "It was Silas Croft's barn," he said, staring into the black liquid. "It is gone. All of it. Took most of his winter hay with it. We saved the house and the livestock. Mostly." "How did it start?" Evelyn asked, her stomach clenching with a premonition. Calder finally looked at her, his gray eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "It started in the hayloft. Silas said there had not been a lamp in there for a week. He found tracks, 2 shod horses, at least 4 or 5 riders. They were not there to help." He took a long drink of the coffee, the cup rattling slightly in his hand. "The wind was blowing from the west last night, blowing away from their house. It was blowing straight toward us." The unspoken words hung in the air between them, thick and choking as the smoke he had just ridden through. The fire had not been for Silas Croft. It had been a message, a warning shot fired across their bow. It was meant for them. The message was delivered more directly 2 mornings later. Evelyn rose before dawn, as was her habit now, to stir the fire and begin breakfast. When she unlatched the cabin door to fetch a bucket of water, she stopped, a small cry catching in her throat. Nailed to the center of their door was a dead rabbit, its body limp, its head hanging at an unnatural angle. A heavy, cruelly driven spike had been hammered through its neck, pinning it to the wood. Its dark eyes were open, staring with a glassy, unseeing accusation. A slow, thick trickle of blood had run down the door, a stark, ugly line against the pale, weathered logs. Hate was no longer a whisper. It was no longer a fire on the horizon. It was here. It was nailed to their door. She stood frozen for a long moment, the cold morning air doing nothing to stop the flush of hot, sick fear that rose in her. Then, a different emotion, hard and cold, took its place. It was anger, a deep, quiet rage that burned away the fear. She refused to scream. She refused to let them have her terror. She turned back into the cabin. Calder was already awake, pulling on his boots. He saw her face and knew instantly that something was wrong. He stood, his expression hardening, and went to the door. He saw the rabbit and his whole body went rigid. A low, guttural sound, more animal than human, escaped his throat. He turned to her, his eyes blazing with a protective fury. "Get back inside," he ordered, his voice tight. "And stay there. Do not leave the house today. Do not even look out the window." "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it was as solid and unmovable as a mountain. He stared at her, uncomprehending. "What did you say?" "I said no," she repeated, lifting her chin. "I will not hide. Hiding is what they want. They want me to be afraid. They want me to be a secret, a shame that you have to lock away inside this cabin. I spent years of my life hiding. Calder, I spent years making myself smaller and smaller, trying not to be seen, praying not to be noticed. I will not do it anymore. If they want to hate me, they can do it to my face." "Evelyn, this is not a game," he said, his voice raw with a fear she knew was not for himself, but for her. "These are not just gossiping women in a general store. This is different. This is violent." "I know what it is," she said, her gaze steady. "And I know that if I hide from it, it will own me. I will not be owned again. Not by a man, and not by fear." Sunday came, a bright, clear morning that felt like a mockery of the darkness that had descended upon them. Evelyn put on her best dress, the simple blue and white cotton that Calder had fought for in the general store. She brushed her hair until it shone and pinned it up with care. She was not dressing for God. She was dressing for battle. Calder watched her, his face a mask of conflict. He had not spoken of it again, but she knew he was terrified. When she was ready, she looked at him. "Are you coming with me?" she asked. He looked at her, at the quiet, resolute strength in her eyes, and a long, slow breath escaped him. He gave a single, curt nod, then went to put on his own clean shirt, the one she had mended. They were going to face the town together. They rode to church in silence. But it was a silence of solidarity. When they dismounted in front of the small, whitewashed chapel, a hush fell over the families gathered outside. The whispers started instantly, a vicious, rustling tide of judgment. Evelyn felt the familiar heat of shame rise in her cheeks, but she pushed it down. She looked straight ahead, her hand resting lightly on Calder's arm, and they walked up the steps and through the open doors. The church was already half full, but the moment they stepped inside, every head turned. The air grew thick and still. They did not pause. They did not look for a seat in the back, in the shadows. With a slow, deliberate pace, they walked the length of the aisle, their footsteps echoing in the sudden, profound silence. They walked all the way to the front and sat in the very first pew. It was an act of defiance so bold, so audacious, that a collective gasp seemed to pass through the congregation. The whispers erupted behind them, louder now, a cacophony of hissed speculation and righteous indignation. Evelyn could feel the venom in the air, 100 pairs of eyes drilling into her back. She kept her gaze fixed on the simple wooden cross at the front of the altar, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Calder sat beside her, straight and tall, as immovable as a stone sentinel, his presence a silent declaration. "This woman is with me. She belongs here." The preacher, a thin man with a reedy voice, stammered through a sermon on the nature of sin, his eyes nervously flicking toward them every few minutes. It was the longest hour of Evelyn's life. When it was finally over, they did not rush to leave. They waited until the pews behind them had emptied, forcing the other congregants to file past them, to meet their eyes if they dared. Most did not. They hurried by, their faces averted, their hypocrisy laid bare. As they stepped out into the bright sunlight, a voice called Evelyn's name. It was Martha Albright, her face arranged in its customary mask of cloying concern. "Evelyn, dear," she said, stepping in front of her, blocking her path while Calder spoke to Silas Croft nearby. "I just want you to know that I am praying for you. It takes a brave woman to show her face after so much unpleasantness." "Thank you, Martha," Evelyn said, her voice cool. "Mrs." Albright leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But you must be careful, dear. A man like Calder, a man with that much anger in him, he is like a powder keg. We all saw it, the day he broke that deputy's nose. He will snap one day. Men like that always do. And you will be the one who gets burned." She patted Evelyn's arm, a gesture of false sympathy that felt like a snake's bite. Evelyn looked at the woman, at the malicious gleam in her small, sharp eyes, and all the fear she had ever felt was burned away by a clean, clarifying rage. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She looked Martha Albright directly in the eye. "I would rather bleed beside him," she said, her voice low and steady, "than smile beside a coward." She turned her back on the woman's stunned, open-mouthed face and walked to Calder's side, leaving her declaration hanging in the air like the smoke from a rifle shot. That night, the cabin was a sanctuary. The battle was over, for now, and they had survived it. They had not won, not yet, but they had not broken. After a simple supper, Evelyn was washing the dishes when Calder came to stand behind her. He did not speak. He simply put his hands on her waist and gently turned her to face him. He looked down at her, his eyes full of a quiet wonder. And then he began to move, a slow, swaying step. There in the middle of their small, fire-lit kitchen, he was dancing with her. There was no music, only the soft sigh of the wind outside and the crackle of the fire in the hearth. She rested her head against his chest, her ear over his heart, and closed her eyes. She could hear the slow, steady beat of it, a rhythm that was strong and true. He held her close, his hand a warm, solid weight on the small of her back. They danced for a long time, a slow, silent circle of two, their breath and their heartbeats and the gentle scuff of their boots on the floorboards the only music they needed. It was a moment of perfect, unadorned peace, a quiet celebration of the simple, miraculous fact that they had found each other in the wilderness. The peace was shattered by the sound of barking. It was not the familiar yip of a coyote, but the deep, frantic baying of Silas Croft's hounds from the next ridge over. Calder stopped dancing instantly, his body going tense. He moved to the window and peered out into the impenetrable darkness. A moment later, they saw it, a flickering of torchlight far down the trail, then another and another, a procession of angry, moving stars, coming toward them. "Get the rifle," Calder said, his voice deadly calm. He went to the fireplace and took down his own shotgun, checking the breech with a practiced, efficient movement. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady as she took the Winchester from its pegs on the wall. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach, but the resolve she had found in the church was stronger. She would not hide. They stood side by side in the center of the room, the firelight glinting off the long barrels of their guns, and waited. The riders came into the yard, a group of a dozen or more men on horseback, their faces hidden by flour sacks with crude eye holes cut out. The torchlight threw their monstrous, shifting shadows against the walls of the cabin. They circled the house like wolves, their voices a low, ugly rumble. One man rode forward, pulling the mask from his face. It was Deputy Travis, his nose still swollen and bruised, his face twisted with a malignant rage. "Read!" he shouted, his voice slurring slightly, thick with whiskey and hate. "We know you are in there. We have come for the woman. The town does not want her kind here. She is a blight, a disease. Send her out, and we will leave you and your house in peace. If you do not, we will burn you both out." Calder slowly opened the cabin door and stepped out onto the porch, his shotgun held loosely at his side. Evelyn was a step behind him, the heavy rifle in her hands. She could see the faces of the other men now, their features distorted by torchlight and hatred. They were shopkeepers, farmhands, men she had seen in church that very morning. "This is my wife," Calder said, his voice ringing out in the night, clear and cold as a death knell. "This is my home. The only one leaving tonight is you, Travis. Get off my land before I put you in it." Travis laughed, a high, ugly sound. "You and what army? Read. There are 12 of us and 2 of you. Give us the woman who does not belong. She belongs with me." Calder said. He raised the shotgun, the twin barrels a dark, hollow threat in the torchlight. Beside him, Evelyn raised her own rifle, the stock pressed firmly against her shoulder. The men in the yard shifted uneasily. They had come for a woman they thought was a coward, protected by a lone man. They had not expected to face them both, armed and ready to die where they stood. The standoff stretched, a tense, silent moment where the only sounds were the crackling of the torches and the nervous stamping of the horses. Then, from the darkness behind the mob, a new sound emerged, the slow, deliberate click of a rifle being cocked. "I reckon the boy's right. Travis," a voice drawled from the shadows. "You ought to get on off his land." Silas Croft stepped out of the darkness, his own rifle leveled. From the other side of the yard, another 2 ranchers appeared, their faces grim, their guns ready. They were men who had eaten at Calder's table, men whose barns he had helped raise, men who valued a neighbor's loyalty over a town's prejudice. They said nothing. They just stood there, a small, silent army of 3. But it was enough. The courage of the mob, which had been fueled by whiskey and anonymity, evaporated in the face of armed, determined men. They had come for an easy victory, not a gunfight. Grumbling and cursing, they began to back away, turning their horses and melting back into the darkness from which they had come. Travis was the last to leave, his face a mask of humiliated fury. He shot one last hateful glare at the cabin before spurring his horse and galloping away. They were gone. The yard was suddenly quiet, the only evidence of their visit the lingering smell of torch smoke and the trampled dirt. Silas Croft gave Calder a grim nod. "You holler if you need anything else," he said. And then he and the others disappeared back into the night. Calder stood on the porch for a long time, staring out into the darkness. Evelyn lowered her rifle, her arms trembling from the strain. She touched his back. He was shaking. He turned and walked back into the cabin, setting his shotgun down by the door. He looked at her, at the rifle still in her hands, at the firelight on her face. He looked around the small, simple room that they had defended together, and then the strength that had held him up, the iron control that had been his shield for his entire life, finally shattered. His face crumpled. A raw, ragged sob tore from his chest, a sound of such profound pain and exhaustion that it brought Evelyn to her knees. He sank down, his back against the wall, and covered his face with his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with the force of his weeping. He was not just crying for the fear of the night, but for everything, for the brother he could not save, for the man he had killed, for the long, lonely years he had spent at war with the world and with himself. Evelyn went to him. She did not speak. She simply knelt in front of him and pulled his head into her lap. She cradled him, her fingers gently stroking his hair, as he sobbed out all the poison and the pain. She was no longer the frightened woman who needed his protection. In this moment, she was his strength. She was his shelter. When his sobs finally subsided into ragged, shuddering breaths, she leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to the top of his head. "You do not have to carry everything," she whispered, her own tears falling silently into his hair. "Just carry me." Later, they sat huddled together in a single chair by the dying fire, a quilt wrapped around them both. The adrenaline was gone, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and a stark, chilling clarity. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The town would not forget this. The hate would not simply disappear. "We could leave," Calder said, his voice a rough, tired whisper into the quiet of the room. "Sell this place. Go somewhere else. Oregon, maybe. Somewhere no one knows our names. We could start over." She rested her head on his shoulder, the thought of it a seductive, tempting balm. A place with no whispers, no memories, no ghosts. A place where they could just be a man and a woman, building a life together. They did not have to decide tonight, but for the first time, they spoke of a future, a fragile possibility they had defended with their lives, a future they would have to choose to build, or to leave behind. The idea of leaving was a seed Calder planted in the days that followed the attack. He spoke of it not with excitement, but with the grim practicality of a man planning a retreat from a battle he could not win. He rode to Silas Croft's ranch and spoke with him for a long time, and when he returned, he began the slow, quiet work of dismantling his life. He mended the harness he would need for a long journey. He sorted through the tools in his barn, setting aside the essential and leaving the rest. He began to ride the boundaries of his land, his gaze not that of an owner, but of an appraiser, measuring its worth in the dollars that would buy them passage to a new life. Evelyn watched him, a hollow feeling growing in her chest. A few weeks ago, this place had been a prison, a windswept outpost of loneliness. She would have given anything to leave it, but now, something had changed. She had poured her own sweat and tears into its stubborn soil. She had planted a garden, and against all odds, small green shoots were pushing their way toward the sun. She had scrubbed its floors and mended its linens and filled its silences with the soft sounds of her own presence. She had bled for this place, and she had loved in it. She had defended it. It was no longer just his ranch. It was their home, and the thought of abandoning it felt like a betrayal, like tearing a piece of her own, newly healed skin. She had found a tentative peace here, a sense of belonging she had never known. The quiet loyalty of Silas Croft and the other ranchers had been a balm on her soul. Even in town, something had shifted. The whispers had not vanished entirely, but they were quieter now, mixed with a grudging respect. A few people, the ones who had stood against Travis, would offer a curt nod when they passed. It was not friendship, but it was a beginning. To run now felt like cowardice. It felt like letting the hate win. But she saw the grim determination in Calder's face, the weary lines around his eyes. He was not doing this for himself. He was doing it for her, to take her away from the poison, to find a place where she could breathe free. How could she tell him that she had just started to learn how to breathe here? The decision was taken out of their hands by the sky. A storm, bigger and more violent than any they had yet seen, rolled in from the north. The sky turned a bruised, greenish black, and the air grew heavy and still, charged with a terrible, waiting energy. The first drops of rain were as large and heavy as coins, and then the storm broke with a primal fury. The wind shrieked like a banshee, tearing at the roof of the cabin. Rain came down in solid, blinding sheets, and the thunder was not a rumble, but a series of violent, deafening explosions that shook the very foundations of the house. They worked together to secure the cabin, barring the windows and stuffing rags under the door to keep the driving rain from seeping in. They lit every lamp they had, a small, defiant island of light against the roaring darkness outside. The storm was a wild beast, trying to claw its way in, and they were huddled together in the fragile shelter of their home, waiting for it to pass. Later, as the storm raged on, they lay together in Calder's bed. Sleep was impossible. Every crash of thunder was a physical blow, making the log walls tremble. Evelyn lay in the circle of Calder's arms, her head on his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against the chaos outside. But even his presence could not keep the old ghosts at bay. The roaring of the wind sounded like her first husband's shouts. The violent cracks of thunder were the sound of his fist hitting the wall. The darkness was a suffocating blanket, filled with memories she could not outrun. She must have drifted off, lulled into a false sense of security by the warmth of Calder's body. But her sleep was not a refuge. It was a trap. She was back in St. Louis. The air was thick with the cloying smell of whiskey and stale cigar smoke. He was standing over her, his face a bloated mask of rage, his eyes bloodshot and cruel. "You think you can leave me?" he roared, his voice the thunder that was shaking the world. "You are mine. You will never be free of me." He reached for her, his hand a claw, grabbing her arm. The pain was sharp, searing. The feel of his fingers digging into her flesh, a violation that was both a memory and a fresh agony. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. He was dragging her back into the darkness, back into the pain, back into the silence. "Evelyn!" A voice cut through the nightmare. A different voice, rough and urgent. "Evelyn, wake up! You are safe!" Her eyes flew open. She was not in St. Louis. She was in the cabin, and the face above her was not her husband's, but Calder's, his features etched with a profound and terrified concern in the flickering lamplight. She was screaming, a series of raw, guttural shrieks torn from the deepest part of her soul. Her own hands were clamped around her arm, her nails digging into her own skin, trying to claw away the phantom grip of the man from her dreams. "You are safe," Calder said again, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of her terror. He gently pried her hands from her arm and enfolded them in his own. He pulled her upright, wrapping his arms around her, holding her tightly against his chest. "It was just a dream. He is not here. He cannot hurt you anymore. I have got you. I am here." She collapsed against him, her body racked with shuddering sobs. The dream had been so real, the terror so absolute. She clung to him, burying her face in the warm, solid strength of his shoulder, the clean scent of him chasing away the phantom smell of whiskey. He held her, stroking her hair, whispering promises in the dark. They were not grand promises of a perfect future, but small, simple, profound ones. "I will not let anyone hurt you. You are safe here with me. I am not leaving you." He repeated them over and over, his voice a low, soothing litany against the raging of the storm, until her sobs quieted and her trembling began to subside. They did not speak for a long time after that. They moved from the bed to the rug in front of the fireplace, where Calder built up the flames until they cast a warm, protective glow against the darkness. He wrapped a quilt around her shoulders, and they sat together, listening to the storm slowly spend its fury. The anger was gone from it now, replaced by the steady, rhythmic drumming of rain on the roof. She turned to him in the firelight, her face stained with tears, her eyes wide and raw with the memory of her nightmare, the need to feel him, to affirm that he was real and the ghost was not, was an ache so profound it was a physical pain. She leaned in and kissed him, a kiss of raw, tearful, silent gratitude. It was a kiss that said everything she could not put into words. "You are my safety. You are my home. You are real." He responded with a desperate, gentle hunger, as if he could kiss away the last of her fear. They made love there, on the rug by the fire, with the sound of the rain as their only music. It was not a dance of passion, but a ritual of healing. It was slow and raw, a final, complete surrender of the last guarded corners of their hearts. Every touch was a promise, every kiss a prayer. She wept silently throughout, not tears of pain or sorrow, but of a release so complete it felt like a breaking, a shattering of the last chains of her past. As she lay in his arms, her body trembling with the aftershocks of emotion, she looked up at him, at the fierce, protective love in his eyes, and the old, familiar plea rose to her lips, a whisper in the quiet room. "Promise me you will not hurt me." He looked down at her, his expression softening into a look of such profound tenderness that it stole her breath. He gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead. His answer, when it came, was not the one he had given before. It was a new vow, an absolute, forged in the fire of what they had just survived together. "Only if you ever leave," he whispered. The sun rose the next morning on a world washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of impossible clarity and a land soaked and shining, the air smelling of wet sage and clean earth. They rode out together as the morning mist was still rising from the hills. They did not ride toward town or toward the boundaries of the ranch. They rode up to the low, wind-swept hill that held the small, lonely cemetery. They dismounted and stood for a long time, looking at the crooked wooden crosses, symbols of all the lost memories and forgotten pains that soaked this hard land. They were not just looking at the graves of strangers. They were looking at the graves of the people they used to be, the silent, angry man and the frightened, broken woman. They were acknowledging the past, paying their respects to the pain that had shaped them, and then, together, they turned their backs on it and walked away. As they rode back down the hill, the sun warm on their faces, Evelyn knew the answer to the question that had been haunting her. "I do not want to go to Oregon," she said, her voice clear and steady in the morning air. Calder pulled his horse to a halt and looked at her, his expression unreadable. "This is our home, Calder," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the green, rain-soaked valley that held their small, battered ranch. "We fought for it. We bled for it. To run away now, it would be like letting them win. It would be like letting the ghosts win." She looked at him, her heart in her eyes. "I am not afraid anymore. Not with you. I do not want to run. I want to stay. I want to rebuild." A slow smile spread across Calder's face. It was the first true, unguarded smile she had ever seen from him, and it transformed his harsh features, making him look years younger. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated relief. "Good," he said, his voice thick, "because I never wanted to sell this place anyway." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. "Evelyn," he said, his voice suddenly serious, "my name is Calder Reed. I want you to have it. I want you to be my wife, in all the ways that matter, in front of God and the whole world." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were tears of joy. She squeezed his hand. "I would rather carry your heart," she whispered, "but I will carry your name too." They did not win the whole town over. Hate, once planted, has deep roots. Martha Albright never spoke to her again, and Deputy Travis looked at them with a sullen, impotent fury whenever he saw them. But they were no longer alone. Silas Croft and his wife started having them over for Sunday dinner. Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper, began to offer a gruff but respectful greeting when they came for supplies. Other families, seeing the quiet strength of their bond, seeing the way they stood together, began to unbend. The whispers did not disappear entirely, but they were largely replaced by a quiet, grudging admiration. They had faced the town's ugliest side and had not broken. They had taught a small, hard lesson in resilience, not through words, but by the simple, powerful act of refusing to be driven away. That evening, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, her journal open before her. The fire crackled in the hearth, and Calder sat in his chair, cleaning a bridle, the scent of leather and wood smoke filling the comfortable silence. For so long, her journal had been a secret, a place to hide her fear and her pain. Now, it was different. She was not writing in hiding. She was writing in the open, in the heart of her home, beside the man who was the heart of her life. She dipped her pencil, her hand steady, and began to write. Not of the past, but of the future. Her final words flowed onto the page, a simple truth she had purchased with tears and with courage. "There is a place beyond fear," she wrote. "It looks a lot like love." Thank you for gathering around the campfire with us for this story. Let us know where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.